Some conversations came up about our end of year meetings with the PDSAs, trying to make sure teachers still saw value in doing the PDSAs through cycle 5, but realizing that the meeting at the end needs to look different since we're not actually starting new groups. So just kind of in prepping for the upcoming meeting on April 8th, I was going through saying, okay, here would be the cycle 5 dates. This is what we have in the calendar. So here on the calendar, you can see that we start cycle 5 here on April 9th. So we have our 4 review meetings here, start 5 on April 9th. We have 5.1 and then 5.2 technically ends here. And that just started some conversations with some teachers about what we're going to do with that meeting. And then as we launched into those conversations, the discussion of should cycle 5.2 end a week early so that we can do some data analysis here, have some team meetings here to discuss both student level evaluation of the programs for that student, as well as entire program evaluation. And that's actually what this next sheet is. So the thought would be that we could look at overall program effectiveness and then student-specific effectiveness. And then I do have a list of questions that we kind of need to think about and if we need to change some things in this potential system. So how it would work would be we would put for each grade level a tab, and it would have the programs, all the programs, and if they didn't use a program, we just wouldn't fill it in. We wouldn't delete the row just for ease of transferring to different tabs. And then for each cycle, we have 5 cycles here. You would put in cycle 1, there were 25 total students and sound partners. If after we've done pathways, which that would all be done on these days, if we ended a cycle early, the interventionist then would not have to meet with groups and they would be going through and getting the pathways data of students. So if they were below or well below, then they would be entered into this number. So 25 total students and sound partners during cycle 1, 15 of those ended the year at below. That means this program was partially effective. And I'll go over my kind of cut points that I chose for that. And then cycle 2, same thing. Cycle 3, sorry, I doubled cycle 2 so I could get rid of one of those. Cycle 3, cycle 4, cycle 5. And then at the end, we would find a way to average all of those cycles and say, overall, this program was blank level effective. So some questions on this sheet that we need to think about would be, should we evaluate all the cycles or just cycles 3, 4, 5? Is including 1 and 2 too much? Other factors would be if we are trying to figure out what other factors could have been impacting the success rate of a program. Should we find a way to include, like if we know a teacher was not effective, do we not include their numbers when calculating this data? Here are the cut points I came up with, and I don't know if these are ones that we like. We can change these formulas, but basically I coded it so that if it's 20% or below, so if 20% of students who were in the program were below or well below, that meant the program was highly successful, so it was blue. If only 21 to 40% were below or well below progress, that meant the program was moderately successful. 41 to 60 of below or well below meant it was partially successful because that's kind of a high number of below or well below. And then if 61 to 100% of your students were below or well below at the end of the year, that means the program was unsuccessful. And then kind of talking about, okay, once we do all this, once we make decisions about this stuff, if a program is determined to be partially successful or unsuccessful, so yellow or red, what would be our next steps for that? Are we looking at, do we want to stop using the program? Do we think we just used it on too many students and we didn't isolate enough? And then are there some other programs that we could look at budgeting for that would maybe fill some of the gaps in between the programs that we have? On a student-specific level, what we would do is, again, those interventionists on these 2 2 days, assuming we ended the cycle early, would be going through and determining all the students who were below or well below. And then they would go through and say, here were all the interventions that we had this student in to see if we could do a trend. So if this student was let's say he's below and we had him in Sound Partners 4 times, obviously Sound Partners was ineffective for this student. Okay. And we group the students by end of year placement in the focus folder group. So A, B, C, D. And we only write the students who were below or well below. Okay, so some of the questions for this is, do we include average as well? Or in order to really isolate, do we just want to include the below and well below students according to end of year pathways? Number 2, what is our threshold for a program being effective or ineffective for students? So if we go up and we say, okay, he had 4 Sound Partners, so we're thinking it was ineffective. Versus if he had it twice, or a situation like this where they did Sound Partners and reteach and Sound Partners, can we really determine a pattern here? Or is this just something we need to look deeper in on the student? Also, the interventionist would have printed the pathways graphs for these students so that we could look at the graph and say, okay, were they growing in Sound Partners and then they dropped when we switched them? So let's say that we had a student here, showed some growth, but then a really hard drop. Usually that might happen. This would be down a level in program, but if we went Sound Partners, and then we bumped them up to a reteach core, if we did that, would that indicate that maybe this drop was bad and Sound Partners was working? So kind of having those graphs already printed would make it so that we could do more specific student evaluation. So again, what's our threshold for a program being ineffective? I think having the pathways graphs would help with that. And then how can we determine if other factors were the issue? Again, should we include attendance rates for these students? Is there a place that we should put, here they were well below, but they were absent 57 days, et cetera, et cetera. So what other factors, if they had an ineffective teacher for when? I spelled that wrong, I do notice, but I'm not going to fix it right now. And then again, what are our next steps with this information? So do we want students who showed, spelling error there, or typing. Do we want students who had, it showed that a certain program is ineffective? Do we flag that student so that next year we make sure we're not just putting them in another Sound Partners group? Again, this comes after kind of evaluating if there were other factors involved. So these are some of the questions I have. Obviously, it would mean a change in our calendar and making our cycle 5 a week shorter in order to have what I would consider pretty productive meetings. And then it could launch into Monday team meetings where they start divvying up students for the next year's classes and using kind of the information that we gathered this week. So yeah, that's kind of where my thoughts are with this. Again, this is in the very beginning stages, so any thoughtful questions or next steps or ideas are 100% welcome, and I look forward to talking to all of you.